Hi, everybody. Part two. So just to finish up about Opal, um, yeah, she's connected to Lucas because they were young lovers, and it's his regalia that Orville tries on. He gifts it to Opal a couple of days before he dies. But there's a great quote on 168 that sums up a lot of their relationship when they were younger, which is that they shared stories. They shared their traumatic stories. And here's the quote, like soldiers back from war. So it's a direct reference, a direct allusion, or direct reference to PTSD. Yeah, like soldiers back from war. That's how the depth of trauma that we can ascribe to a lot of First Nations identities. And again, history, right? Remember how the part one, history was trapped in them, and they were trapped in history. So this is all sort of flashing back and telling their stories of their histories, and how both Octavio, coming up soon, and Opal, her present is completely rooted in her past, for good and bad. She likes her life. I think Opal's having a very successful life. She's provided a wonderfully stable home for these three boys. Right? There's another little quote coming up about her. There's a great quote about, this is the final thing I'm going to say about Opal, on page 170. Cramping my shoulders here. She got big to avoid shrinking. She'd chosen expansion over contraction. Opal is a stone, page 170. And if you remember when Opal was describing how her mother died, she described her mother as just slowly shrinking away, becoming smaller and smaller until she wasn't there anymore. And so subconsciously, Opal's saying, that ain't happening to me, right? I'm going nowhere. I chose, or this isn't first person, this chapter. It's omniscient, an all-knowing narrator is seeing into her thoughts. But so she became big to avoid shrinking. So that sort of, that growing bigger is reclamation, right? It's definitely reclamation. She got big to avoid shrinking. She'd chosen expansion over contraction. To become bigger as opposed to smaller. Opal is a stone, page 170. That links her to nature too. You know, the strongest material in nature, stone. And that connects to me as she's a very good mother. You know, she's literally a great aunt, but she has made a very stable and safe home for those three boys. Octavio, just when you were thinking that we had a clear villain, right? We don't. There's nothing is black and white in this world. Nothing is black and white, obviously, in the way that I mean it. And Octavio certainly is such an interesting character. He is one of the most damaged of the characters. He's the most angry. He's lost the most. He's had so many losses, all at the hands, all as a result of his uncle Sixto, his father's brother, who was a thug, is a thug. He's still alive in the story. He indirectly, but almost very directly, caused the death of his father, of Octavio's father, in that he had stolen some pot plants from this gang member, and this gang member was pissed about it, and there was a drive-by shooting, and Octavio's dad sacrificed himself for his son, throwing himself in front of a bullet, or protecting Octavio's body with his own, and he was killed, and Octavio was not. And later, Octavio, or Sixto, his uncle Sixto, had a terrible problem with alcohol, and when he was drunk driving, he had an accident and killed Octavio's mother and his sister. So his uncle Sixto has been responsible for the loss of Octavio's entire family. So, yeah. Octavio's life trajectory into crime and violence is anger, right? It's misplaced anger. Yeah. His sickness at the beginning, he starts off the chapter where he's got the flu, a flu-like thing, and he goes over to his grandmother house, Fina. Her name's Fina. He goes over to her house, and she's a healer, sort of an ancient traditional healer, and she does help him get better. But I like to think of that sickness as being more than literal. Right? Fina's the only one in his entire family, of which he has very few left, who provides a positive influence, right? She nurtures him. She does heal him. He loves her. So we see a different side to the hood, right? We see a different side to the criminal. So I like to think of that flu sickness at the beginning as a metaphor for his spiritual sickness, for his psychological sickness, for his trauma, for his PTSD, for his loss of identity and culture. There's some great, this is one of my favorite chapters actually. There's another one that's coming up soon, not today, but soon. There's some fantastic imagery in this chapter. Page 175, the sun would come in through one of the bullet holes, a bullet hole shaped ray of light, right? The bullet holes that were caused by the drive-by shooting, but sometimes when the sun would hit them exactly right, a stream, like a laser beam of light would come into the room. And interesting imagery there, right? Like even in the darkest, even in the most damaging of moments and times, there can be some little bit of light that comes through as a result. And it connects to one of my favorite lines by Leonard Cohen, actually. He talks, I forget which poem it is, but the line is, everything has a crack in it. That's how the light gets in, right? And there's a lot of truth to that, about embracing imperfections and finding even a terrible beauty, if it has to be a terrible beauty, if it has to be terrible, finding a beauty in those cracks and thinking of them as opportunities for enlightenment. You know, sometimes those imperfections. So that's some beautiful imagery. And then the other imagery that I really like here is the picture of them driving around in their stolen cars, right? They're driving into the sunset. They're joyriding. They're having the time of their lives. They're stepping out of their own they're not small lives. They're stepping out of their own trap, of a life, an identity, a trap into criminality, and they're assuming they're escaping from that for at least a couple of hours anyway. They just dump the cars. They don't do anything with them. They just ride around in them. And freeing themselves, right? Having them try on another person's identity, another person's, by way of another person's car. And then the mourning dove. Oh my God, the mourning dove imagery, which is so terrible. Octavio, in his pain and anger and sadness, one day just shoots a mourning dove. It's quite graphically described. It's terrible beauty in the writing. He just can't, he's just angry at the bird for making him feel more sad, being yet another reminder of what he's lost. And so that's a pretty intense moment. And there's I should have written more of the quote here, but page 180, and I've picked up the quote from this point on, with no control over the wild possibilities reality threw into their lives, which is the reason that's given for him shooting the bird, just wanting to have another reason for him shooting the bird, just wanting to control in some way a reality that you don't feel you have any control over. And that's definitely how Octavio feels. I mean, his whole family's been taken away through random acts of generational trauma evidence, right? In the shape of Sixto. His uncle Sixto. There's some great diction on page 180. Hella fucking sad seeming, right? That's great diction. Diction, remember, is a literary term for word choices that an author makes. I just love that line. I like the way it sounds. Hella fucking sad seeming, right? Sad seeming, having a hyphen in it. That's on page 180. Describes Sixto to a T. Sixto shares with him that he thinks that their family, and again, this relates to generational trauma or loss of culture, loss of identity, generational trauma. Sixto thinks that, and this is a quote on page 181, we got this old thing that hurts, real fucking bad, makes you mean. Right? That's how he explains why he's the way he is. He sees it in Octavio, obviously, by now, because, you know, he's explaining, he's rationalizing why he's never had a reputable life in any way. So there's a curse, right? That sickness that that I was talking about when he had the flu, that sort of spiritual and emotional sickness. That's this family curse. The whole family has been cursed by it, according to Uncle Sixto. I don't know if any of you watch American Gods, but oh my God, it's a good series. Very violent, but it's so good. Oh my God, it's so good. And this chapter reminded me, I was thinking it could be an episode in American Gods, because Fina is sort of this spiritual healer, so she's feeling that myth making of the gods. And Sixto is like the leprechaun, who is, he's just a character that goes through life just causing these explosions of trauma all around him. And of course to himself as well, but he just destroys so many other lives around him. It's like biblical, you know, epic, epic proportions. And in a small way, in a very much a way, I find anyway, if you've seen the show, you'll know what I mean. He's very much like the leprechaun figure, just does so much damage to other people around him. It's just ungraspable. There's another, remember I was saying a couple of videos ago, or in one of the discussion sentences, that another thing that a lot of the characters have in common is that they all take trips. We see them in transit. We see them on the way to somewhere else, on the BART, or riding bicycles, right? Orville and his brothers and Tony rides all around the city. They both, all four of those young people, ride their bikes all around the city. We see Dean on the subway. So they're always in transit, right? They're always off to do something, or like never settled, right? They're always in between something. So here there's another journey, of a spiritual journey, not just a literal journey, but a spiritual journey of healing for Octavio to get some badger fur, which apparently we got to go to this place a couple of hours drive out of Oakland, to get this badger fur. And that's how the chapter ends. But Fina gives him some really good advice. Another great quote on page 185. She gives him some really good advice that some of us got this feeling stuck inside all the time, like we've done something wrong, like we ourselves are something wrong, like who we are deep inside that we want to name but can't. So we hide. We drink alcohol because it helps us feel like we can be ourselves and not be afraid, but we punish ourselves with it. Page 185. I promise you that's the longest quote I'll ever give you. But I mean, it just backs up everything about generational trauma, and that history is a trap. One more thing about history I forgot to mention, I think. Who writes the history, right? Who writes the history? The settler generation has written the history. So as some of my students last year that I had in grade 11, we learned that histories are fictionalized, and the First Nations traditionally have always been painted as the villain, painted as the bad person in the Western, the negative force, the devil, right, the savage. And I've gotten off track, but I just wanted to say that something about that history is a trap, and that history is trapped within them, because only the last couple of decades have First Nations been given opportunities to restate the history, to retell the history, to be their own historians, as opposed to it always being from the white person's perspective. Back to this, I'm almost done here. So that's a great quote about loss of identity and the alcoholism, and the how all the characters are somehow impacted negatively by alcohol, either through themselves or generationally, right? More generational trauma. That's it. That's all I have to say. The next chapter that I'll do this for is, I'll pick up. There's Daniel Gonzalez coming up. He's the one that's making the 3D guns. He's an unwilling cohort of, a somewhat unwilling cohort of Octavio's. So we're getting closer to the story of it's the return, right? It's the return. It's when everything is coming together. We're building up to our climax. We're getting very close to it. And the powwow is mere days away. And yeah, so there's a couple of chapters with that. And then we meet our final new character, who is Blue. A girl, her name is Blue, great name. I'm not going to do any scene stealers for that just yet. But what I would suggest is we read up to the end of the Blue chapter, and which goes from, it's not very far down the road, actually. It's very close. There's the Daniel Gonzalez chapter, page 187 to 196, and then we've got Blue, 197 to 207. So that's 20 pages of reading. And yeah, okay, I'll shut up now. I'm just trying to think of what to have you do, right? Other than just read. The discussion questions didn't work so well. Maybe I'll certainly do another little lecture video or whatever, but just trying to think if maybe we can do a journal write, just so you get a chance to, I'll think about it more. Okay. Have a good rest of the weekend, honey bunnies. And like I said before, I hope that you are finding ways to feel like your normal self. I know we're experiencing our own on a global scale, loss of culture, loss of identity, right? We're right now with our isolation. But anyway, I hope you're well. Yeah, do things that you love, and I will talk to you soon. Okay, bye.